Thanks, everyone. I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about single sign-on. So it says up there that it's a beginner's guide to SSO misconfiguration. What do I mean with that? I mean, I'm going to try and make sure I define all my terms. And I'm talking really about the level of conversation that's had between like key account managers and people who are buying software. So it should be pretty accessible. But I think if you're an expert, I'll probably send you home with hopefully some new nightmares or maybe some old ones that you've experienced before. So I think it should be interesting to everybody. Let's see how we go. So again, what exactly am I going to talk about? I'm talking about my perspective as somebody who works for, like I said, a big energy company. And we need to buy services from a lot of vendors, software as a service, platform as a service, etc. So yeah, I'm specifically coming from the point of view of a company buying a service and trying to make sure that it works for us. I am not going to talk too much in detail about the technical setup. So you're not going to see any code here today, unfortunately, from me. But I think that we'll still have some interesting questions that just happen at the people level before we even set anything up. And I said maybe a bit here, but I really think that it actually will give you some good hints if you're on the other side of the equation from me, as a vendor talking to big companies, because the big companies won't necessarily know the questions, or small companies even, won't know the questions that they should be asking. But if you know a few of these questions that I think are important for me to ask, maybe you can also have those discussions with your customers. So why am I giving this talk? I started implementing single sign-on on a few of our systems a couple of years ago, and I found out fairly quickly that if you implement SSO, it can make you feel safe. You've checked off that nice checkbox. But you can actually be hiding things that are even worse than they were before when you had basic authentication. But I don't want to leave you in the depressing dark. One thing that I found that is great is that questions are your superpower. So if I leave you at the end of this talk feeling empowered to ask questions of your customers and your vendors, then I think that you'll be in a much better place. I mean, question asking is a great skill for anything in your life. I think it's a superpower for your career, and yeah, if you want to learn new things, don't feel afraid to ask questions. And my opinion is there are no stupid questions. There's only mean questions and mean answers, but there are no stupid questions. Just ask. You will find things that you didn't expect. All right, so I did claim that it was beginner friendly, and I'm about probably 3 minutes in, and I should answer, what is SSO? What am I even talking about here? And why does your company want it? So those of you advanced people, maybe this will be a little bit catch up for you, but we'll go through it quickly. So I went to Wikipedia, of course, and I got the definition. Single sign-on is an authentication scheme that allows a user to log in with a single identity to any of several related yet independent software systems. So what does it mean? It means that I want to be able to sign into my company and then be able to access all the stuff that my company has without having to have a second set of credentials or even sign in again. Why does this matter? Well, in the past, or if you ask some people still in the present, I don't know, you had everything inside of a building, probably. You may have only had like 5 or 6 colleagues. You would go into the building, you'd have a little server that you could even physically plug stuff into, or maybe a file cabinet. You owned all the keys, you could recognize everybody's faces when they came in, and you had everything under control. But now, of course, we live in the cloud, so you might still have some stuff that's on-prem, but you probably have a bunch of stuff in this weird cloud thing of other people's computers. And the most important question is, who's controlling these ladders that get into that cloud? How do you make sure that people are only accessing your business information if you want them to? Well, that is the promise of SSO. You have all this vendor stuff, and I guess I could have labeled it as SaaS or PaaS or IaaS or whatever, but for the context here, that's not so important. It's just stuff that's important to your company, your business information, that's on somebody else's computer. What SSO lets you do is you put your same lock and key, your company, on these ladders so that the only people who can get access to that cloud have to go through you. So, sounds pretty great. The dream of single sign-on is wonderful. It promises that we can centralize managing users. And the most commonly actually satisfied claim here is that if you have a colleague named Bob who leaves the company, and you have 17 different SaaS providers that you need to go in and disable them from, I'm glad it's not my job to go into all 17 of those and disable them, because I'll forget one and then we'll be in the news. With single sign-on, as soon as they can't sign on to your company, whether or not those accounts still exist in the vendor side, they shouldn't be able to access them. So that's really helpful. It stops me from forgetting to disable Bob's account and yeah, having a bad day. It should make life easier for your colleagues. Of course, I'm sure that every single company that you work for, it has a really great password manager that everybody has. They use perfect, strong, unique passwords for every single thing that your colleagues sign into. There's no text documents on the desktop, and no one is reusing their Windows password for every single thing that's work-related, right? Well, when you have SSO, you step away from that concern because you don't have 17 different credentials that you need to manage. You can have one set of credentials that you can hopefully manage to remember one good password and have good MFA, et cetera, protections on there. The other thing that SSO allows you to do is have one place where you can enforce consistent security standards. So you can say, this is really important. I want only people who are on a trusted device to come in. Or I'm not going to let you authenticate if your IP range is coming from North Korea. Or if you just signed in Chicago, I'm not going to let you sign in 5 minutes from Dublin. So there's all kinds of things like that that your IT security team now has control over because it's not just sitting on the vendor system. All right, but you may have guessed I'm calling it the dream, and we have a nice house of cards here, so I'm not convinced that this is how life is at all times. And the reason for that is, if we go back and look at what the heck is SAML protocol? SSO protocols are just a way for my company's identity provider to tell the vendor, yeah, that's Bob. That's all. That's all they are. And given that that's all they are, we can run into some problems. So going back again, why am I giving this talk? I was this really idealistic little blob a couple of years ago. I thought everything was great. I had heard about single sign-on, and I thought it was a great thing. My IT security colleagues were like, yeah, we should do this because we want to control it. Then I found out my vendors offer SSO. So it's like, well, just turn it on and everything's going to be awesome. Yeah, this is the start of a horror movie, and you're all yelling at me not to go into that basement, that the light switch wasn't working. Okay, so now I'm this slightly more cynical blue blob over here. And I've realized that if I want to implement any project, but especially one around identity and access management, before I start working on it, I need to figure out what I'm trying to do. What do I need? What use case am I trying to solve by actually implementing this? And write it down. Then I need to figure out what my vendor can do. How do they see the problem? What problem are they trying to solve? And how does that differ from the problem that I have? And then critically, once I think I understand these 2 points, I need to ask weird questions, going back to up the top. Communication is hard, people make mistakes, and it is really easy to think that you understand both sides of the equation and just think, oh, that would be a silly question to ask about this edge case. No, you need to ask all those edge case questions. And I'm going to give you a few questions that you can ask by the end of the talk. So for the next little while, I'm going to go through these 3 points one by one and talk to you about what I need, what I think my vendor's perspective might be, and then we'll go through some questions and some scary nightmares at the end. So starting with, what do I need? I have found that repeatedly, unfortunately, that when I'm trying to implement any kind of project that is beyond a certain level of complexity, it's very helpful to decide, what am I trying to do before I run madly off in all directions and start doing things, right? What's my actual goal? So to start with here, what I'm going to do is come up with 2 simple ideas, hopefully simple, that I want to achieve with my single sign-on setup for my company. And yours may differ, but this is a starting point. So need number 1, users need to sign in through my company before they get to my business information. Seems reasonable. So my company's identity provider needs to approve every single sign-in, and only after people have signed into me can they access my company's stuff. And need number 2 is users can only access their own stuff. So once I've said that's Bob, and Bob signed in, Bob can get into Bob's account and nobody else can. And Bob also can't get into Alice's account. And if there are any exceptions, which sounds kind of wild at this point in time, but if there are exceptions, they need to be clear. So now we've figured out approximately what I want. Let's talk about what my vendor can do and why their perspective, or your perspective, I think many of you are vendors, might be different than mine as a customer. So the reasons that they're different, SSO isn't the first thing that somebody builds when they're trying to sell a new service, right? I'm buying this service because they're building a cool new internet thing, or a really done old internet thing, or a slightly janky, but they won the EU tender, so I have to buy it anyways thing. But they didn't build an SSO first. SSO only comes in when one of their big customers comes in and says, My really annoying people in security told me that I can't pay you next year if you don't implement this. And we've got 3 months. So please check this box so that I can keep giving you money and using your service. So when they do build SSO, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to do it badly, but they'll have different ideas about SSO than any one individual customer. And that makes sense. They have just a lot of different use cases. So as a customer, you need to make sure that you understand what approach they have to SSO. So for example, what might their ideas be that are a little bit different? Here's one. They might want to allow single sign-on but not force it. So this can be a really convenient thing, especially if you're like B2C. You want to offer people the option of signing in with an account they already have or of making one themselves. It's very useful in a lot of scenarios. They might not care about anything in their vendor account matching your identity. I mean, this makes sense. Like my YouTube account doesn't have to match my Gmail account, you know? There's lots of reasons where this can make a lot of sense. And they might let users change their own information. So this is, I think, really important. We need to let people change their names. Names are not static things. Names can change over time. And yeah, it's very important. However, if I am allowing my users to change their name every hour, I'm going to be in a world of pain because I won't know if it is Bob or the CEO, Alice, who made changes to that document. And I can't tell who's who. So I need to understand how these kinds of name changes can happen. And here's a good example of something that I set up at the top I don't want, which is shared accounts. The vendor might have a really good reason for having shared accounts. I mean, at work, I use shared email accounts for questions about certain topics, right? There's lots of reasons you might want to have shared accounts. So you just need to make sure that you understand where the mismatches are and what kind of problem you're trying to solve. Then there might be places where username and password is still available. So we have our nice little, okay, only SSO is allowed here fence, but we also have a nice little robot entrance for my skateboarding dog to just skate right through. And yeah, if you haven't done something clever with ephemeral tokens that depend on who's issued them and where they're going, you can have a world of pain over here, especially if those tokens last for 10 years. So yeah, again, there might be use cases where this is okay, depending on your threat model and how you're setting things up, but you really need to understand what the deal is. Is this entrance, for example, available to every single user or only users that I can configure? That would be good to know. Okay, so now we know what we need and what the vendor can do. We have our chickens over here, which are the vendor accounts, and we have our purple broccolis that are the company identities, and we need to translate between the two of them. Thank you to Microsoft for the lovely clip art. So I live in Germany, and I didn't grow up speaking German. I learned it as an adult. One thing I've learned about translation is that, again, back to the main point, if you assume that you understand what's going on when it's something important, and you don't ask questions to make sure, you're going to have problems. So now we think we understand what's going on both sides. Let's talk about what kinds of questions you can ask to make sure that you have the setup you need. Fortunately enough, that was point number 3. All right. So now I'm going to go through all of the needs that we talked about before, break them down in a bit more detail, talk about questions you can ask, and fun nightmare scenarios that might come up if you don't ask all the questions that I suggest that you should. All right, so I said the first need was users need to sign in through my company. What does this mean in detail? So I want them to only use my company's sign-in, not like somebody else's sign-in, which seems kind of wild. Like, why would you be able to use someone else's sign-in? But okay, let's write it down here. And point B, again, is that I want to force use of SSO. I don't want that skateboarding dog to have a backdoor that allows you to use basic auth to get in. So what are the weird questions I can ask about this? Let's start with A. Only use my company's sign-in. This question seemed completely off the wall to me to begin with. It's like, is there a way that someone signing into a different identity provider could get into one of my org's accounts? Like, what? I set up my organization to allow my people in, but then I thought about it for a little bit longer and I was like, okay, what about those lawyers or that due diligence firm that I let in last year to do some work for a couple of months? They needed access to everything as if they were an employee, but we didn't really want to send them a whole laptop and set them up completely just like we would for any other employee. So there are situations where it actually really makes sense to have that reciprocal trust and say, these specific users at this other company, we're going to trust their user setup just as much as we trust our own. But the problem becomes here if we don't actually ask, and this is possible. If we ask and it's possible, we need to at least be able to monitor for it if we can't completely shut it down and control it, which I think it would be ideal if you can control it, but sometimes you can't. So here's the failure case, and I've chosen a plate of spaghetti for my failure cases to indicate that you don't know where a vendor account and an identity connect and how that whole thing works. So if you don't ask questions, you might find this. Turning single sign-on on for your organization's accounts could allow anyone else with the following two things to get in. The first thing is any signed-in identity in any other single sign-on setup connected to the vendor. That could be a really big crowd of people. What's the chance that none of those are compromised or bad actors? And the second thing you need is still the username and password for your org's vendor's account. So to be fair, this isn't necessarily worse than basic auth, because if they just had the username and password of the vendor account, they could have gotten in before. The only thing is here, you might be assuming that, that this isn't possible anymore because you've turned on single sign-on in. So if you have both of these things, you sign in with SSO, then you bump yourself back to the vendor view, and then it's like, okay, which account do you want to link? Here's the username and password. Now they're all linked together, and everyone can get in. Nobody gets notified. Not you, not the user. That is the real failure scenario. If you don't know this is possible, you aren't looking for it in the logs, you aren't checking your user accounts to make sure that nothing's linked that shouldn't be, that's where you have a big problem. If at least you know what's going on, and hopefully that's not a premium service to actually take a look at all of those logs, it doesn't require you to email support, that's really, the problem is if you can't look for it. All right. So my next thing that I needed was, I wanted to force the use of SSO. All right, so what's a question you can ask? Will you ever fail away from my sign-in? This is actually a pretty useful one. As SREs, I think you're probably also used to thinking about, making sure that the business process is able to still run. Whatever failure you have in the system, you want your users to be able to get their job done, because if they get their job done, then they don't have to come to you for liquidated damages, right? So for me, we're running wind farms. I need to figure out how can I keep things running even if something really bad happens. And failing away from single sign-on actually could be a good thing. If a disaster happens and we have another NotPetya, my company completely gets owned, I could work with IT security to find my 10 most important users and bring them back onto this SaaS system, which isn't in our infrastructure, as long as I disconnect the SSO. So this can be useful, but the point of the story is I need to know how it happens and make sure that, again, if it does happen, I know about it, and then I can put the appropriate controls in place. Because then those backup break in case of fire accounts need to have a lot of security on them. I don't want them to be another basic auth that's got a shared password with the cool dog website. That would be a bad thing. And then what access is enforced for API users? Are they allowed basic auth, like my little skateboarding dog? Do they use OAuth 2? Do they use OIDC? That would be great. But what happens if you don't ask these questions? So in this case, my vendor did a couple things I'm really happy about. They enforced single sign-on using the user interface. So in fact, everybody who goes to the front page is pushed through my SSO and they can't get in any other way. And they gave me control over how API users authenticate. I have some nice OAuth 2 tokens. I have a good refresh schedule set up so that those tokens don't just sit around for 10 years. Everything is good. But their own app can't use SSO. They developed it 5 years before they developed the SSO, and it has not made it onto their roadmap to fix it. So every single user, and also the worst case would be if I can't turn this off. Every single user with that crappy password that I wasn't worrying about anymore because I've got SSO turned on, they can still get access to all of their information either through the app or by pretending to be the app. So yeah, asking about all the different ways that people can get in is a really good plan. Oh yeah, and the only way to monitor this, by the way, is by looking at logs. And again, I hope that you actually have access to those and they aren't either a premium service or something you have to send support a message every week to get. All right, need number 2. Users can only access their own stuff. So breaking this down a little bit more, Bob can only access Bob's vendor account and not Alice's. And I don't want any shared accounts. Again, those can be useful, like I said, but in this case, in this scenario that I'm talking about, I don't want anything And again, I want any exceptions to be really clear. So what questions could I ask? So again, like I was discussing before, if Bob has the username and password for Alice's vendor account, can he access Alice's account too? Because he's got an SSO identity on my side and he has the user credentials. Would that be enough? This gets a little bit away from beginner. I feel like most of the folks in this room are probably aware of what attribute mapping is, but in case you're not, it's the way basically that you can say something about my identity in my company needs to match something about the vendor account. So maybe that's email address or a user ID or a name or something. And the point of the story is when you sign in with the identity, you get a return handshake from my identity provider, and then that return handshake usually is what figures out which actual vendor account you're going to be attached to. So that would stop this username and password malarkey. But yeah, if you have attribute mapping, this is going to be a really good thing because it means that I will have some obvious way of saying these identities are going to access these user accounts. But of course, if the mapping relies on user editable fields, then at the very least, you're going to have problems because people will go in and change things about their account and then that linkage won't work anymore. And in the fun case, we can get some interesting attacks. So let's see. If you get answers that you think are totally correct and reasonable about the top three, I would still encourage you to take a little bit of time and in your test account that you're setting up, go in and just change everything that's accessible for a user to change in that account and see if you can still sign in. And if you can't, then you have a problem. It can also be fun if you can't to get someone to set up a new account with all the data that matches and see if you can sign into that without having to set anything up. So a little bit of a spoiler alert for my next slide, which is, okay, attribute mapping wasn't in the minimum viable product. They just had to get it out or they were going to lose their biggest customer. This is not inherently a terrible thing. You can set something up like this that will be okay as long as, again, it's clear what's going on and it's visible to admins. Okay, so they made a lookup table. They linked usernames that were linked to UDPs of the identity provider. Okay, so the UDPs shouldn't really be changing and the usernames shouldn't really be changing, right? But the username is editable in the vendor name system. So now you have a lookup table, half of which is user editable. So if people go in and start changing their usernames, which they can do, and is totally a reasonable thing to do if it's available, then suddenly they won't be able to sign in anymore. Or we have a new fun attack unlocked. So let's say I used to work for my competitor, and I know how they like to name the accounts in the vendor system. So I know that they just hired somebody new who's like pretty important in the company named Cal, and they're gonna give that account the name Cal Competitor. So I'm gonna make myself an account on my organization called Cal Competitor. And I'm gonna link that to my Adina identity. So now in that lookup table, you have the Adina identity linked to the username Cal Competitor. I'm going to change the username to test, test, test. Now I can't sign in, but that's okay because Cal Competitor is now available for my competitor to make him an account with. So they've made an account with the username Cal Competitor. The lookup table says the Adina account lets you into Cal Competitor. No one gets notified of this. Nothing is very visible to somebody who's actively looking for it. I mean, this would be pretty great. I can just go in and do whatever the heck I want. I didn't need the password. I didn't need anything. Yeah, so it's pretty bad. All right, so what weird questions then could I ask about not wanting to have shared accounts? For this, I don't have anything super creative. Just like make sure you ask about how shared accounts work, make sure you understand how they work, and make sure how you understand how you can control for them. And if they say they're not allowed, maybe just push and make sure like, whoops, are there any edge cases where they do allow them? Are there any scenarios like, I don't know, admin accounts are, of course, the real fun ones to ask all of these questions about because they're often the ones that have the weird exceptions and, of course, the most dangerous ones to break. So here's a failure case that could happen if you don't understand shared accounts and you just assume that they don't offer them because that is how you understand things should work in your company. Okay, so you didn't ask and they offer them. All it takes is Bob signing into my company and entering, like I said, Alice's vendor username and password, which is available because Alice used the exact same username and password on the Cool Dog site, which got breached. So now Alice's account can be accessed by Bob and Alice. And the worst case scenario, again, is if you don't know and nobody gets notified when these linkages are set up. So yeah, it's very useful to make sure you're asking these questions. The next slide is about a real life incident. It's the Squarespace Google Domains situation, which you could argue doesn't quite fit into this, but I think it does. So what happened was Google used to be able to buy domain names from Google, and they decided, as they do, that they no longer wanted to offer the service. So they sold all that business off to Squarespace. So after they migrated everything over, domain admin accounts were created for the migrated domains, which just had basically the email filled out, from what I understand. Okay, that's fine. If you sign in, then you set everything up properly and that account is locked down. Everything's great. But when you take a look at how the Squarespace sign-in flow works, you'll see that up here you can sign in with just an email address and a password. And the problem that happened here is that Squarespace made at least two assumptions. One was that domain admins would sign into their Squarespace accounts like as soon as they were available, make sure they were set up properly, make sure everything looked great. Which, I mean, you know, people are busy. They don't necessarily get to everything on their to-do list on time, right? And the second thing that they assumed is that people were always going to click the continue with Google button, right? If they click the continue with Google button, because they were Google domain customers, makes sense, right? Then they would basically be linking the Google SSO to Squarespace and everything would be fine. So if people kind of slept on this and they didn't sign in, the problem was that all you needed to do was guess the email address that was the domain admin. And then it would prompt you to set up a password, right? And there was no need for this account to be confirmed. The email address, they know it works. It's the domain admin. Like, why would they need to check that that email actually works? So any attacker who just guessed the email could just go in, enter the email, be prompted to create a password, and then have access in here. And they wouldn't email the actual email to be like, congratulations for setting up your Squarespace account. Again, the account already existed. So this was bad. A bunch of crypto people lost their money. You know, it was a very bad day for a lot of people. And I think having control of the domain allows you to do basically every single nasty thing you want to do to a company. But there's an additional fun thing here, which is that once you had that domain admin account set up, you also got a backdoor kind of into the Google Workspace. That account allowed you to log into Google Workspace as the admin, which does make sense. I mean, I put this in scare quotes so your reseller can help with troubleshooting. But I think there are a lot of cases where you are maybe sharing the responsibilities between the people who are running the domain and the actual domain admins. So there are some good reasons for some use cases, probably not crypto selling, where you would want to have these accounts linked. So yeah, they really got owned by this. It was a bad situation. And the problem here was, again, just the assumptions that they made. You know, assuming people would go in and set up their accounts and allowing people to continue with Google, but not forcing that. If they just said, you can only get in with your Google SSO, then this problem wouldn't have happened. All right. So what is the point of this talk? Before I actually wrote this talk, I went to talk to some folks in hackerspace that I'm remotely affiliated with, and I was like, hey, I'm thinking about giving a talk about SSO misconfiguration. And they were like, ugh, misconfiguration is boring. It's nothing new. And like, nobody needs it. There's a million ways to fail. Just do everything right. And I mean, I don't know where these people work. Obviously, I ended up disagreeing with them. I think that I can understand the perspective of, look, I just see everybody messing up all the time, and why don't you RTFM? But on the other hand, we're all humans and not machines. So I disagree, because I think that the thing is that not everybody knows how easy it is to mess up in identity, you know? Especially people who are talking at that sales level, right? When I'm talking to my key account manager, they don't necessarily have all the knowledge that they need. And I don't necessarily, on the other side, have all the knowledge that I need. So yeah, I think it's really important to emphasize that messing this up doesn't just happen at the code level, but it really happens at the people level. And we need to be paying attention up there. And once again, if we ask questions, I think we have a much better hope of setting these things up in a way that we actually want them to be set up in, and getting setups that serve us, and don't just let people come in and steal all our crypto. I don't have any crypto, so you can't steal mine. But yeah. So again, I hope that at this point in time, I've given you a few questions that might be able to soothe some of those nightmares that I've also given you. And with that, I look forward to your questions.